tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Welcome to week 6, our final week of the summer 2020 online class on the quality of attention. Our topic for this week is attention to liberation. And we've spent the last month or so exploring ways of directing the mind, this concept of attention and various kinds of attention. So beginning with mindfulness, various forms of investigation, and samadhi, a kind of collected attention of the mind. And we've looked at various aspects of experience, the principles of reality, the principles of experience, and how attention can be directed to those principles, what kinds of attention are helpful in the exploration or the discovery of those principles. So principles like impermanence and emptiness and dependent origination or interdependent arising and unreliability or unsatisfactoriness of experience. So all of these types of exploration are held within the context of the Noble Eightfold Path. That is the path to awakening, the path to freedom, to liberation. And to be sure, there are, generally speaking, two different ways to talk about liberation, and we see them emphasized more or less in different Buddhist traditions. So there is liberation described as freedom within each moment, freedom within the present moment. And some ways that we hear about that kind of liberation are, for example, Hakuin saying that as we begin in practice, we are like crying out in thirst right in the midst of water. And then later Hakuin says that there is this understanding that without water there is no ice. Without ice there is no water. So this is freedom within the moment itself. Or there is the sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya, the numbered discourses. That was one of the readings for this week. It's called a sutta called Rooted by Bhante Sujato, or the Roots by Bhikkhu Bodhi. So in Bhikkhu Bodhi's particular version of the Anguttara, it's on page 1410. The Book of Tens, number 58. And it can be a little bit of an enigmatic sutta, but I will read for you just a bit of what it says here. So the Buddha says, "Friends, all things are rooted in desire. They come into being through attention." Now I'm reading from the Bhikkhu Bodhi translation. "They originate from contact. they converge upon feeling tone. They are headed by concentration. Mindfulness exercises authority over them. Wisdom is their supervisor, and liberation is their core. Freedom is their core. All things have freedom at their core. This is from the Buddha himself, at least as recorded in the Pali texts, and I believe in the Chinese texts known as the Agamas. They culminate in the deathless. Their consummation is Nibbana, or in Sanskrit, which might be the more familiar word for some of you, Nirvana. So what is it to say that freedom is the core of all things? That's what we're going to explore a little bit today. But just to keep going a little bit about how we sometimes hear about freedom, or the way that it's described at different times and different traditions. There's also the quote from the Hoshinji newsletter, fall 2008. That was an assignment a couple weeks back, I believe. But for this class in particular, I would point you at the bottom of the second paragraph on the first page there, where she says, essentially, however, all things on earth, including the thoughts of single individuals, arise as something in accordance, or we could say in harmony, with you. In accordance with, or in harmony with, means that while it appears as if you and the earth are separate, this is in actual fact a condition in which all such things can be seen as problems of your own consciousness. So he's explaining that the sense of separation is the problem of our own consciousness, rather than the reality. So that is a way of talking about freedom or liberation. Vimukti is the one of the Pali terms in the present moment, in each and every moment. And then we also see a way of describing freedom or liberation as the culmination of the path, as the ultimate coming together of all of our practice and our effort to awaken. And ways that we hear about this, I would suggest, are, for example, Eihei Dogen saying that all beings are Buddha nature, and yet without practice it is not realized. Without practice, Buddha nature is not realized. Or there is the Buddha himself saying in one of the suttas that we looked at earlier in the course, the sutta from the linked discourses, or also known as the Samyutta Nikaya, 22.23, chapter 22, number 23, the sutta called Complete Understanding. Right? And in that sutta, the Buddha says the 5 khandhas should be completely understood. The ending of greed, hate, and delusion, or even momentarily, I would suggest. So there we can have quite a discussion about the meaning here of complete understanding or full understanding. Even Bhikkhu Bodhi in the footnotes to this particular sutta describes various ways of understanding that term. And I mentioned some of that in the class forum and in response to a comment from Michaela. So you can have a look at that. But complete understanding, the ending of greed, hatred, and delusion, whether momentarily or the complete destruction of greed, hatred, and delusion, as Bhikkhu Bodhi translates that particular sutta. And then we also have Zen Master Changcha. Master Changcha. He is the main focus of his poem is the main focus of our reading this week. And in this poem, he says, he's pointing at something called the mind seal. Mind seal. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that and about the rest of Master Changcha's description of how we might experience the mind seal or understand its transmission. So I'm reading from the translation from this text, Unfathomable Depths, which is my ordination master comments on Song Dynasty China Chan Master Changcha's 10 verses of Unfathomable Depth. So my teacher is Sekkei Harada. He's recently passed away. But these were his comments from a number of years ago, actually, only recently, only in the last few years, translated into English. So the first of the 10 verses of Unfathomable Depth. So maybe I give a little introduction to these verses before going ahead too much further. So as I said, Master Changcha, Song Dynasty China, Northern China in particular. The verses were given this title by one of the later editors of the Chinese records, and these 10 verses were chosen as one of a very select group of poems that were said to represent the totality of Chan teaching, the pinnacle of Chan, so Chinese Mahayana Buddhism teaching. And so this title was not given by Changcha. That would be a little bit of an arrogant thing to do, to give them the title that they did finally receive and that we have today, which is Jugendan. Jugendan is how it is pronounced in the Japanese. I'm not quite sure of the Chinese pronunciation. I'm not so good at Chinese pronunciation, so I'll leave it at that. But just to say, those three characters are 10, Ju, 10. Gen. Gen is a beautifully nuanced word, which means many things. In this case, probably deep, also mysterious. It also can mean dark. But I would say in this case, probably deep and mysterious. That's why my good friend Daigaku Rume Roshi and Heiko Narag translated that word as unfathomable. And then Dan means verses or talk or chat, something along those lines. So these 10 verses are said to be describing the whole of Chan practice. So the first 5 are explained as the doctrine, and the second 5 are understood to be the practice instruction, the more specific practice instruction. But for our purpose, I think we'll see that there is some practice discussion or direction in this first section as well, this first verse. So the first verse is called the Mind Seal. And this is Master Changcha saying, I ask you, quote unquote, what does the mind seal look like? And what sort of person dares to transmit it? Throughout the ages, it has remained firm and unshaken. As soon as you call something the mind seal, it is already meaningless. You must know that in essence, all things originate from infinite emptiness. You can compare it to a lotus flower in a red-hot kiln. Don't say that a free and empty mind is the way. A free and empty mind is still separated from it by a great barrier. So just to unpack this verse a little bit, in the hopes that this helps us to learn a little something about liberation in the context of mind, in the context of the quality of attention, in the context of feeling tone, impermanence, emptiness, kamma, action. How is it that all of these aspects of experience that we have been studying are demonstrating something that can wake us up to the true nature of all things? So he asks us right away, what does the mind seal look like? It's an enormous question. It's what I want to say is, you didn't even offer me a cup of tea yet, or give me any direction, and here you are asking the ultimate question, Master Changcha. What's that all about? Huh? So I just want to say a little bit, and that is this seal is referring to, in a literal sense, is referring to the Chinese and also Japanese custom of using an actual stamp for one's signature, a seal. A seal of authenticity is how we might understand it in the West. Like some kind of little foil thing that goes on your diploma or your certificate of completion of some course or something along those lines. You won't be getting a certificate of completion with a seal on it from me for this course. Hopefully you will be discovering the value of it for yourself. Nonetheless, the mind seal. So the seal represents what? The verification of the authenticity of a thing. So what is the verification of mind? That is what Changcha is asking us right here in this very first question. And he's not going to tell us yet what mind is. That's the next verse. But right now, this question comes up. What is it to verify the mind? And what sort of person dares to transmit the verification of mind? What does it mean to transmit the mind seal? So again, he's referring in a sense to the literal, which is the way of Dharma transmission. So there is no such thing, I'm told, in early Buddhism, this concept of Dharma transmission, of student being verified by their teacher as what? As having received the Dharma. Or I would suggest as having come to the natural discovery of oneself as Dhamma. So this is something that's done in the Chan and Zen schools. I'm not sure about other Chinese or Japanese or other Mahayana schools from other countries for that matter. But there are actual ceremonies and there are actual certificates with actual red ink seals on them. I happen to have some I could show you if you're curious about that at some point. So he's talking about something literal, but he's also, of course, referring perhaps much more strongly, much more importantly, referring to the awakening to Dhamma of an individual and how another individual would be able to recognize such a thing. So I leave open those questions for a moment, or perhaps for quite a while, as koans for you. But then he starts to give us some pointers. He starts to give us a cup of tea and tell us a bit more about the thing that he's pointing at, the thing that he's inquiring about, the experience or the attribute that he wants us to observe. And he says, throughout the ages, it has remained firm and unshaken. Throughout the ages, it has remained firm and unshaken. So I take this line, and I want to say, I am offering my own interpretation of Master Changcha's poem. I can't say what it was that Master Changcha intended with this poem with any kind of certainty. And I am offering, I'm not offering my master's interpretation necessarily either. In some cases, I would agree with what Harada Roshi has offered. In other cases, I'm adding something to it or actually offering a different interpretation. So my interpretation of this particular line is the it in this line is referring to the mind. It has remained firm and unshaken. And so that brings up a couple of associations for me, several associations. So first of all, this throughout the ages, the first part of that line brings up for me the 5 epithets of the Dhamma. So in throughout the early texts, we see the Dhamma described as having 5 attributes. And the first one of those is apparent here and now. So that's what we're talking about. That's what we've been exploring all along, actually. The Dhamma is apparent here and now. And then the second, so that's Sanditiko. And then you have Akaliko. And Akaliko is the timelessness of Dhamma. The fact that the Dhamma is not bound to a particular century or a particular cultural context or even a particular linguistic context, but that it has a timelessness. It is applicable across the human experience, both historically, in ancient history, in more recent history, in the present moment, in the future. So this throughout the ages, the timelessness of Dhamma, it has remained firm and unshaken. So this mind that is firm and unshaken. So one way to think about that is Zen Master Miaoxin. Last week in week 5, we had a reading about Zen Master Miaoxin and her explanation of a koan to 17 monks who came to actually visit her teacher, and not her. But she concludes by telling them that the mind does not move. The mind does not move. So what mind is it that Zen Master Miaoxin was pointing at when she says the mind does not move? I would suggest she's pointing at the same mind that Chan Master Changcha is expressing here, or that we see in the Mahamangala Sutta, so in the Sutta of the highest blessings from the early Buddhist tradition, there is a verse in which we say, although, toward the end of that sutta, although involved in worldly experience and worldly tasks and worldly events, there are different ways to translate that piece. Although involved in worldly tasks, is how we translate it here at the Aloka Vihara, unshaken the mind remains. So this is a mind that encompasses all of the other attributes of mind that we might be able to discern. Those moving parts like the clouds that we think of, the thoughts that we might think of as clouds, or the chain of events that lead on from feeling tone to perception to mental formations. Or the vast, vast context of an individual consciousness and the context in which that vastness is also held. So the next line says, as soon as you call something the mind seal, the verification of mind, it's already meaningless. So for Zen folks, this is a pretty common teaching, the teaching that the concept is not the same as the thing itself. It's not that concepts are not useful, they are most certainly useful. And we interact with concepts within our practice quite frequently. And they can be helpful frameworks, they can be something against which we compare our own experience, they can be something aspirational, they can be something describing our suffering, all sorts of ways to understand concepts within practice. But this is basically pointing at the way in which concept cannot capture the thing itself. So the verification of mind is not an idea. You must know that in essence all things originate from infinite emptiness. Now we are getting closer. We are getting closer to Master Chancha's true meaning. Emptiness was our topic from last week. Empty of self, empty of permanent existence, empty of independent arising. So it means conditional, based on the presence of the supporting causes and conditions. And because of that, it also has the connotation of a kind of fleeting characteristic. It has the connotation of insubstantiality. And so infinite emptiness, so this infinite is pointing at the fact that conditionality also implies a connectedness. Each thing is related to its supporting causes and conditions, and the supporting causes and conditions of the next thing, and then the supporting causes and conditions are related. Those supporting causes and conditions related to the supporting causes and conditions of the next thing. So each thing, each person, each place, each object you experience, all of those things are connected one after the other, after the other, after the other, in an infinite integration of all things. So vast that its boundary cannot be discerned. Even a Buddha The Buddha himself, the historical Buddha, is said to have said very clearly, said to have taught very directly that there was no observable beginning to experience, to the connectedness, the causal nature of things. You can compare it to a lotus flower in a hot kiln. You can compare the mind seal, the verification of mind, or perhaps even just the mind itself. You could compare it to a lotus flower in a hot kiln. So what does that mean? So a red hot kiln is full of fire. It's full of the fire element. And fire typically in the Mahayana, as distinct from early Buddhism, I would say, it's very different in early Buddhism. But fire in the Mahayana means a kind of purity, a kind of complete, pure burning away, transformation. As distinct from early Buddhism, where the Buddha, for example, used fire in one of the earliest discourses to describe the way in which life, human life, contains suffering, is fundamentally unsatisfactory. Nonetheless, here, this fire represents purity, and the lotus flower. So what is the metaphor of the lotus flower? Many of you may know this. So the lotus flower represents also purity. It represents, it's a thing, literally in the world, a lotus flower is rooted in the mud of a pond, and then it grows up through the water, and it comes up a nice straight stalk with a beautiful bud at the top. And when it comes, once it gets out of the water, then with enough sunlight and enough water and warmth, then that bud opens up and it flowers. It becomes a lotus flower. A beautiful, clean, right? The mud stays in the pond and it nourishes the flower actually. It makes the flowering possible, but the flower itself is free of the mud. It's clean, it's pure. So both the fire, the red hot kiln, and the lotus represent purity. So Changcha is saying the verification of mind is purity meeting purity, or purity contained within purity. Or we might, instead of using this word purity, which perhaps has a lot of strange connotations in the West, we might say absolute clarity. Clarity meeting clarity. But don't say, and then he cautions us, lest we become a little confused about what this means. He says, don't say that a free and empty mind is the way. So again, the way meaning the Noble Eightfold Path, or also sometimes used just as shorthand for the culmination of the path. Don't say that a free and empty mind is the way. A free and empty mind is still separated from it by a great barrier. So this incredibly precious, fleeting purity meeting purity is not about having a blank mind. Or even he says a free mind. So what is that all about? Liberation is not just a free and empty mind. So free here, we should not confuse this. This free isn't the equivalent of freedom or liberation. When he says a free mind, he doesn't mean a liberated mind here. He means free as in free roaming, a flexible mind or a malleable mind, or a mind, we might say, wieldy, that could be easily wielded, used. A well-trained mind is maybe how it would be referred to in early Buddhism. So don't say that a free and empty mind is the way, because what? Because that's only part of the picture. And liberation cannot be only part of the picture. It must encompass all of reality if it is to be really understood as liberation, as an awakening to reality. Harada Roshi gives us this pointer about this line. He says, we must work at not being attached to anything, not being attached to a mind that is calm or quiet or malleable, or conversely, to a mind that is busy, that is investigating, that is full of thoughts, that is suffering, that is clinging to experience or craving after experience. So I see this particular last line, a free and empty mind is separated from it by a great barrier, as perhaps Master Changcha pointing at the necessity of both samatha and vipassana, at the necessity of both the stilling, calming, steadying kind of practice and the insight into the nature of experience, how causes and conditions actually work together within our experience. So some schools might say this is both jhana and vipassana, or the insights, the knowledges, the so-called knowledges, or various kinds of insight meditation practices like the Satipatthana or the Anapanasati, or meditation on the 5 khandhas or the 6 sense bases. All of these types of insight practices. Or in the Zen tradition, in Master Tongcha's tradition, might be known as, in the Japanese Zen tradition would be known as Zazen. So Zazen may include both of those two aspects, the stilling aspect and the insight into phenomena, if there is enough steadiness and enough clarity, enough groundedness in the practice and enough clarity. Otherwise, shikantaza, or the most common way that Zazen is described as meditation practice or sitting practice in the Japanese Zen tradition, otherwise shikantaza can become very rambly, very cloudy, and kind of free-floating. So what is it that might overcome this great barrier? Or what is it? So first of all, interesting also that Changcha describes a great barrier, even though he has already told us that all things arise out of infinite emptiness. So what is this great barrier that must be overcome? That is, the overcoming of that barrier is the prerequisite, you could say, for Dharma transmission. So let me suggest that overcoming this barrier, some ways to think about overcoming this barrier are that we would have insight into what are known as the three characteristics or the three marks of existence. So the first mark of existence is impermanence. Impermanence, the fact that all things change. The second mark of existence is non-self. So non-self really is very closely related to emptiness. It's talking about, again, emptiness is talking oftentimes about the emptiness of a self. There is no self present. So non-self means that this body and mind, or any body and mind that you might encounter, are merely temporally arising phenomena that are not driven by or contained within or having any kind of core or essence that defines them. Okay, so not driven by any kind of core or any kind of essential existence, but the mere temporal arising and mere temporal coming together of causes and conditions in such a way that this being is here. And then the third mark of existence. So in early Buddhism, we say the third mark of existence is dukkha, is unsatisfactoriness. That is, because things are fleeting and impermanent and insubstantial, empty, non-self, then we experience suffering over them because we would like them to be otherwise. We would like them to be supporting our sense of a self. We would like them to be more permanently existing, or at least around when we want them to be around, rather than around on their own, in their own time, in their own way, based on their own sets of causes and conditions. And then in later Buddhism, it's said that the third mark of existence is nibbana, that all things exist within nibbana. And for a long time I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's a twisting of those three marks from what they used to be. But as we just saw in the Root Sutta, the Buddha does say, again, the Buddha does say in the Root Sutta, the consummation of all things is nibbana. So to see the three marks, or perhaps now 4 marks of existence, is one way to understand how to go through this barrier, how to leap beyond this great barrier of the sense of separation, really. The great barrier is really the sense of separation, the sense of self, an essential self. And so again, this pointer, lest we lose it, this pointer that Master Changcha has given us, you must know. So he doesn't say understand or learn, at least not as it's translated here by Daigak-san and Heiko-san. You must know that in essence all things originate from infinite emptiness. So that's a funny sentence sometimes for us, and I want to unpack that a little bit because, again, I think this is a beautiful pointer. So how is it that something could originate from emptiness? We looked at this a little bit last week. And perhaps a good metaphor or a good simile for us this week would be like a lump of foam or like a bubble. So a bubble is really just like water and air and a little bit of surface tension. If we looked at it very clearly, it's just a little bit of water, or maybe there's a little soap thrown in there for fun to make it easier, to make the bubble, or some other kind of liquid. So there's liquid and there's air and there's a little bit of surface tension such that it has this roundness to it. So actually there is no such thing as bubble. It's just liquid and air and energy. And it's momentary. It would never occur to us to think that a bubble should be eternal. That's not its nature. It doesn't even make sense to have that wish. And in the same way, a human life is merely that. It's merely the coming together of earth and air and fire and water. In a particular shape, or billions of different particular shapes, and a consciousness that goes with that, a karmic, a resultant of a sort of karmic impetus. And it is equally fleeting, just as fleeting as a bubble or a lump of foam on the top of your dishwater or your espresso. And yet there can be this wish for it to be eternal, or for it to be much more permanent or essential than it actually is. And the one question might come up was, well, so if we see that, if we're willing to accept that, then how does that help? How does that, why is that such a big aha? So for that, I'd like to tell you the story of the blue fan. And it's a story that I like to tell quite often. It has various instructions or various teachings within it. And for that reason, it's pretty useful and it comes up for me often. But today I want to tell the story of the blue fan in this context, in the context of what the Dhamma is revealing. So it was summertime in Japan, in Obama, which is the small town, yes, same as the former president's name. Small town on what they call the backside of the main island of Japan, Honshu. So it's on the strait between Japan and Korea and China, the Japan Sea. And so therefore, it's the climate there is something akin to the northeast coast of the United States. So that means it's chilly and snowy in the winter, and it's very hot and humid in the summer. And so it was summer in Japan, in Obama, and it was very hot and it was very humid. And in the monastery, these are monasteries built in very traditional Japanese style. So the walls are literally made of paper. The floors are literally made of grass mats attached to some thin wood, and or just the wood without the grass mats. And so when it's hot outside, it's hot inside too. So in their great benevolence, the senior monastics and Harada Roshi, Sekkei Harada Roshi, who is my ordination master, was, because now he's passed, had handed out some fans, some just, basic plastic fans. And so it was in an oval shape, like maybe about this big, and had a little white plastic rim and a little white plastic handle, and it was blue in the oval shape on both sides, blue with some kind of little white dots on it. And so that was our defense against the heat. These fans were handed out, and so some of the senior monastics had gone off to a meeting, and they were coming back from this meeting, and they wanted to tell everybody about what had happened at this meeting. So we were going to have a meeting within the monastery, all of the monastics. And we were going to do it in this room right off the kitchen, which in the evening. And so we knew it was going to be pretty hot. The overhead lights would be on in this room. And so everybody was told, bring your fans. So great. So I put my fan on my desk so I would remember to bring it with me to this meeting. And when I put the fan down on the desk, I noticed that that little blue section with the white dots on it in the middle was not just random white dots, but rather that they were a map of the night sky. It was a map of the constellations. And that was kind of interesting. And I was kind of, chagrined by that. I thought, oh, that's so classically human, that rather than go sit outside under the actual night sky, where it might be a little tiny bit cooler, we're going to sit in this other room here next door off the kitchen and fan ourselves with the concept of the night sky. Great, but that's very human. That's what we do. The meeting's going to be next door in the room. So meeting time came, and I went to the meeting, and I sat down, and the whole meeting was taking place in Japanese. And my Japanese is terrible. I only speak a tiny bit, skoshi dake. I only speak a very tiny bit of Japanese, so I really wasn't understanding anything that was going on, and it was really hot. And we're sitting there under the lights, and I was kind of just melting with the heat. And we're all kind of packed into this room anyway, which is making it even more sticky and uncomfortable. And I'm not really listening to what's happening. It's just kind of, blah, 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 going on. And so I was seated and next to my friend Ryudo-san. Ryudo-san's name means Dragon Way. He had been a farmer before he was a monk, and he was incredibly enthusiastic, Ryudo-san. He was sitting next to me, and he was fanning himself with his fan, same as my fan, identical. Fanning himself. And so I was watching Ryudo-san's fan. And at one point, he flicked the fan, and it went white. It was so brightly illuminated that it just caught me by surprise. And then flick, and he flicked the fan back in the other direction. And there it was again. The map of the night sky. The fan with this blue piece of paper on it with the little white dots, and then flick, and again, brilliant white light, completely wiping out any concept of sky or fan or blue. And then flick one more time back to the fan. Paper, plastic, maybe some blue ink or some white ink. And in that moment, I started to understand a little something about what we mean when we say that the Dhamma will reveal to you something which has already been there, and yet it was completely out of sight. So the nature of this fan was luminosity, was brightness, was light. And yet that wasn't apparent until the moment when the causes and conditions flick, and the causes and conditions came into place, fell into place in such a way that my attention directed at that thing then received it fully. Luminosity. Non-conceptual, not fan, not map, not sky, not blue, not paper, not plastic. So it wasn't that, it's not that there's anything special about the way that I was looking at the fan, or about me, or about Ryodo-san and the way he was flicking the fan, or what the fan was made of, or any of those things. It was just the moment revealing the luminosity. So the Dhamma will do this for us. The Dhamma will reveal things that we have yet to experience. Right there in the midst of our suffering, right there in the midst of that very mundane experience, right there in the midst of the everyday. It's already always been there. But there is a moment at which we can wake up to it. And Radha Roshi has a beautiful way of describing this. He says, if the viewpoint of the self does not intervene, Dharma and Dharma merge with each other. If the viewpoint of the self does not intervene, then Dharma and Dharma merge with each other. So there he is, just like Master Chongpa, describing the complete absence of the sense of separation. And that, I would suggest, is a pointer in the right direction, a pointer toward verification of mind, a pointer toward how we can actually attend to liberation. So thank you very much for your attention and for your practice throughout this class. Now this is the very last recorded Dhamma talk. We'll have, of course, one more group discussion in a few days. But as it's the last recorded talk, I want to just mention a couple of housekeeping items. One is, again, thank you so much for sharing. Those of you who shared poems, those of you who engaged in the dyads and shared your practice with one another, or posted questions to the forum, posed questions during the course discussion, or privately with me in email. All of our practice together. I'm very, very grateful and encouraged. And I want to also let you know that there is an evaluation form at the bottom of the class syllabus page. At the very bottom, you'll see that there's a link to an evaluation form. Do let me know if you have any trouble filling it out, but you should be able to just click through and fill it out. It's a very brief, I think 6-question survey. It's completely anonymous unless you decide to write your name in the comments on the last box there. And that will help me to know a little something about how you felt about the technology, about the time of the class, the material, etc. And then lastly, please do stay engaged with me and with Dhammadipa.com and with Aloka Vihara. my calendar, I'm trying to keep the calendar up to date these days, and so there will be, I think, at least one more streamed Dharma talk on a Saturday from Aloka Vihara during this summer. I'll also be offering a day-long online retreat. So it's not the whole day, it's not 8 hours online, but a day retreat hosted by Red Clay Sangha in Atlanta. That will be on November 7th, and you can go to redclaysangha.org. I think it's .org, maybe .net. In any event, Red Clay Sangha, you can search for it. And we'll do a day together on November 7th, Saturday, November 7th. And also the registration for the New Year's retreat. So Aloka Vihara's New Year's offering is shortened to 5 days, and we'll have a 5-day online retreat. And those dates and the registration for that will be coming up here probably third week in August, August of 2020. And there will be no cap on the registration for that. So please feel, and it's a by donation offering, just as this course has been. So also thank you to everyone who has offered dana in support of Aloka Vihara and my practice and our practice here. It's very much needed, and we do our best to make sure that it is put to good use in creating more and more Dhamma. Also, I'll be offering a class in Spanish in the fall. I'll be offering a class on the poems, the awakening poems of the women of the Buddha's time in Spanish, probably in October, but check the calendar there. All right, thanks again for everything, and please be well, and please practice until complete liberation for the benefit of all beings.